We're seeing a rise in sextortion, the extortion through sexual images on young people. Children in intermediate schools are accessing adult content online. It is happening on a daily basis. But creating trust within the education environment is what is key.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight on Student Digital Safety, the Courier podcast, where we unpack the most interesting stories, strategies, and learnings on student digital safety for schools, by schools leading the way all around the world. I'm your host, Yasmin London, and I'm incredibly excited to welcome today's spotlight guest, Colm Gannon. Now, Colum is the CEO of ICMEC, which is the International Centre for Missing and Exploited Children across Australia and New Zealand. Welcome, Colum. How are you going today?
Hi, Yaz. How are you? Good to have you. Good to be here.
It's so good to have you here. I love doing these episodes where we get external experts that aren't necessarily in schools, but work in the spaces that schools really do need to know about. And your work at ICMEC is incredibly important. Could you share with our audience a bit about what ICMEC does, just so we've got a good top line understanding?
Yeah, so ICMEC, the International Centre for Missing and Exploited Children Australia, is looking to build a safer environment for children free from sexual abuse and exploitation, working with other partners and stakeholders to collaborate, proactively engage, and also make changes to how we actually deal with the online and offline space. It's all about protection of children, all the way from 0 to 18.
That's a big sort of scope of work that you've got there. And I think, when I speak to schools, a lot of the time, this sort of content is important, I guess, but it's not sort of front of mind. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today is really why this is the new, I guess, area of focus, if you will, for schools when it comes to safeguarding their students. But before we do get into that, I want to share a little bit about you, your background. You've got such an interesting background. Could you walk us through your digital safeguarding journey? How did you get to ICMEC? Where did you start? I know that you've had a lot of experience with schools. Can you share a bit about that?
Yeah, so obviously by my accent, I'm not native to Australia, so the Irish accent will come out, and I do apologise to anybody trying to read the subtitles within the videos. But I can say that previously I worked with An Garda Síochána, that's the Irish National Police Service, working in counter-terrorism and organised crime. Then went over to New Zealand and worked with the Digital Safety Directorate. The great thing about working with the Digital Safety Directorate was that I was part of the Online Safety Advisory Group for the Ministry of Education across New Zealand, which brought in principals from secondary, so high school, primary school and intermediate schools, working with government sector to actually promote healthy and safe digital environments within the education sector. And obviously, the topic that we're discovering and discussing today is I was also part of the multi-government agency Porn Working Group for New Zealand, which actually looked at the impact of adult pornographic material towards young people across Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Wow, that's a big scope of work. Lots to unpack, I guess, in that topic area, and it's a really interesting one for us today. It's an uncomfortable topic, isn't it? Talking about pornography, especially in the context of education. Are there any misconceptions around this when it comes to schools that you think that we could start us off? What are some of the things that you think are maybe not quite the truth that we need to make sure that schools know about?
Yeah, I think some of the schools need to know about is that children in intermediate schools are accessing adult content online, and that the young persons within high schools and in that environment are accessing adult content on a regular basis. Um, and that it's also forming their sexual ideation in a sense of how they see relationships, right down to what they define as consent and non-consent. And I think schools need to recognize is that that can have a drastic negative impact within their schooling environment, where they realize it or not. So it is something that's been accessed regularly by young people.
Yeah, it's really quite I guess, a little bit confronting in terms of how regularly they are accessing this, and of course how that's creating their kind of sexual scripts, if you will, of life. I was looking at some statistics that I'm going to read out here. The average age in Australia and New Zealand for first-time porn exposure is between 11 and 13 years old. Of those, 53% watch it at least once a week, with 12% viewing it daily or most days. 80% of those aged 14 to 17 have viewed it. Those are really high statistics. And, what I read from that is that, once they have viewed it, the repetition of views is dramatically high. Now, we need to get better at understanding this, talking about this, don't we, Colum?
Absolutely.
What can we do as educators and as carers, I guess, as well in this space?
I think one of the first things is we need to acknowledge that this is happening, and that the persons between the ages of 11 to 13 years of age are accessing adult content, whether intentionally or being exposed to it unintentionally. It is happening on a daily basis. And it also has health implications in relation to young people. So we're actually seeing an increase in erectile dysfunction with young people between the ages of 14 to 16 years of age, which was not seen before. We're also seeing the level of aggressive behavior and gender discrimination taking place within the young people environment, both in and outside the school. So I think what we need to do is we need to start having the conversation. And thankfully, as we're having this conversation today, and hopefully people will start saying, oh, okay, we need to start looking at what is pornography, what is relationship, and how do we actually come up with strategies to actually deal with this within our education environment.
Yeah, we really do need to. I think, you've got a background in policing, as do I, and you've probably seen this. One of the first experiences that I had as a police officer was in terms of really realizing the impact and the offline impacts of pornography, was going into a hospital emergency room and talking to a doctor there who started to sort of share the, I guess, prevalence of violent sexual injuries that young people were coming in and presenting with. And, this is something that we do need to have those courageous conversations around, because intervention, I guess, is key. We know, I was looking at another statistic, that 72% of kids have said that they don't feel comfortable discussing porn with a parent or a carer. So who's the next best person? And sometimes that's going to be, educators in schools. It's going to be the people that intervene. And we were talking earlier, you mentioned that actually kids are viewing this sort of content quite regularly on school devices, on their mobile devices, on the way to and from school. So this is a school issue, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done research with the Medical School of Berlin and Carleton University in Canada, and we actually did an examination of the level of interaction with adult pornographic material by young people. And a lot of them are just viewing it on buses and train stations going to and from their schooling and education environment. It's happening in schools where they're actually viewing it, because while we have the unlimited data access coming to mobile devices, while we have access to devices that are purely in the control of these young people, they're accessing pornographic material, they're sharing videos, they're sharing images, and now they're also using other technologies to actually involve gender discrimination towards other young people and distributing them across the school. It causes a hostile education environment for the school. It causes relationship degradation. And I think this is something that we need to really focus on. It's happening. It's happening now. It's been happening for a while, but it's escalating further and further as we have more and more technology services being made available to young people on the device that used to be a supercomputer when I was growing up.
Yeah, we all had the Nokia 3210s, and I'm grateful for it back in the
Yeah,
day, showing
yeah.
my age there. But I mean, a hostile school environment, that's such a great way of describing it. What does that look like in reality? What does a hostile school environment impacted by pornography and technology in this way look like? What might people be seeing?
Yeah, what was actually interesting when I worked with the porn working group, we had a youth advisory, and I was sitting down with a 15-year-old member of the youth advisory group, and they were saying that sometimes when naked selfies were found belong to a person, or sent to them by a person, they were holding them in a folder on their device. And if they actually offended them or actually caused disruption, they would literally just disperse those images across the school environment as a way of retaliation. We know this to be non-consensual intimate images, but they didn't see any repercussions from a legal framework in relation to this. They just wanted to get back to the person who offended them or they had strife with. So the reality is, when we're looking at the hostile working environment or the education environment, because it is the students' jobs when they're sitting there in school or in their education area, is that that is actually breaching the trust, the community, the interaction within the environment. It also has an impact in relation to their ability to learn, because they're stressed or they're actually planning the next retaliation campaign against someone who's offended them. So what you're getting is, you're not getting 100% from your students. You're getting students who are attending the classroom, and what they're feeling is like, I don't have time for this. I'm under stress. I'm actually feeling quite isolated.
Yeah, it really starts to become a vicious cycle, doesn't it? We've got unfocused students, we've got students whose well-being is impacted, distractions, devices that are being accessed, and I guess behaviours that are occurring that may be illegal, can cause reputational damage to the school, of course, as we've started to see this sort of stuff get out. So it really is important that we address it, and even from an education point of view, being able to have those conversations and know where to look. Now, you mentioned that students are hosting these images on their devices, and I think there's sometimes a bit of a misconception that this is always sort of shared on social media, that it might be a picture that's shared on Snapchat because of the disappearing content feature, but you're saying that they're actually holding these images in folders on their devices. How do we know what to look for? How can schools manage that?
So, and this is the biggest quandrum that actually happens in relation to educators and the school environment, is because we're seeing these being airdropped, or we see them actually being distributed through a non-connecting network. And it's literally just being dropped into the environment and added to all devices that are broadcasting. And so it can be quite difficult. And I think the key part of how educators actually deal with this is looking at education in relation to attitudes, education in relation to how we see people or how we interact with people. We have seen this from a New Zealand context in relation to, you briefly spoke about injuries and health. We have seen this disconnection actually taking place, which resulted in the porn working group being set up within New Zealand, because there was a major disconnect within the school environment. Educators, teachers, pastoral care, they can actually feel the tone of the school and the environment, and they go, there's something up, I don't know what it is, but they can actually feel a shift in the atmosphere within an education framework or in a system of the school. So I would say is that educators will know, they know there's something up deep down, and they're kind of going, well, we need to actually find out what this is and how we actually going to put an intervention in place.
So what does that look like? Is that talking to students, creating opportunities like provocations in classrooms? Is it using, wellbeing check-in tools that are anonymized and confidential, for example, even though that's a bit tricky in of itself, right? We want to make sure that we're able to act if there's a mandatory reporting requirement. What are some practical ways that schools could do that?
I think there's what we call slight persuasion. And there's ways that we can actually move to slight persuasion. And I often talk to people and kind of going, how do you actually understand consent, or how do you understand relationships? And some of the simple things is actually using these online reality TV shows where people are sent to an island and actually talking about having boyfriends and girlfriends. I'm not going to name the show, but actually using that in media studies and actually looking at the interactions. What happens is it kind of makes the students kind of see the teachers as someone who's actually in touch with reality. Then barriers start to come down, because we're discussing, do we think this is a good way that this relationship should be portrayed? Is this person actually representing the best part of themselves? Is this something that we call a normal interaction? You're teaching a number of different skills there. You're teaching digital literacy, you're teaching media interpretation, then you're opening discussions on the floor. What happens then is you're starting to create the pathway for having conversations. I really don't believe in anonymization tools, because that in itself can create complications, but creating trust within the education environment is what is key, and bringing in realities that they deal with outside of school, or programs that they're looking at outside of school, allows you to actually start building that discussion. It's a
Yeah.
really cost-effective way of doing it.
It's so it seems simple, right? But it's meeting kids where they're at and using relevant current technology, ideas, television shows, whatever it might be, just having a sort of finger on the pulse a little bit about what their interests are and finding a way to connect the dots there. I mean, what came to mind for me when you were talking is, this rise of synthetic relationships and chatbots and, things like character AI and how they're interacting with that. Now, AI and how that works is a whole different topic, but ultimately that's a great provocation to use to help understand where they're coming from. You can talk about things like, how do we feel about commercializing intimacy? How can this impact data and privacy risks? Is this normalizing problematic behavior? What are your thoughts? And often when we really genuinely involve kids and are open and curious to their opinion, we get back what we're looking for. We get a really engaged young person who's willing to talk, right?
Absolutely. We like definitely the educators will talk about this as being cognitive feedback, because when you have people that are engaging within the actual class, you can see you're actually hitting the mark with your subject. Even with pastoral care, you can see you're actually hitting the topic quite quickly
Mm-hmm.
because you get that cognitive feedback from the students or the participants within the discussion.
Yeah.
And I know this was something that was brought out within the Irish education system, a country that's considered quite conservative in relation to its beliefs. They brought in the social, personal, and health education into the schools that deals with pornography as one of the modules in that education plan. And they talk about what does actual consent look like, what is actually happening, obviously not showing the adult pornographic material, but
Mm.
discussing what's going on. And they're talking about what is your attitudes towards porn? Do you think it reflects society as we should see it?
Mm.
Like even when we're looking at the first sexual interactions, there was research from the North Carolina universities. Females between the ages of 13 to 17 years of age, their first experience or sexual encounter was asphyxiation, um, which is a highly escalation in relation to sexual behavior.
Mm.
But that's because there's overuse of pornographic material being
Yeah.
experienced by young people, and that's their first actual sexual experience is asphyxiation.
Yeah, wow. That's incredibly concerning, isn't it? And the way that this is evolving when it comes to pornography, that violent element, particularly gender-based violence, violence against women. I believe the statistic was around 96% of it of porn generally across the world depicts violence against women, but around 98% of that pornography is met with the violence is met with a positive or pleasurable response. How bad is that? I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Is not only do we think that asphyxiation is, something that is acceptable or wanted, but it's enjoyed. How do we address that with young people? Is it more education?
I think it's actually talking about consent, but actually going
Mm.
to the very basis of consent, not consent within a sexual manner, because straight away you're going for the actual jugular when you're talking
Mm.
to young people. Straight away the barrier is coming up. But when you're talking about consent, consent to friendship, consent to engagement with each other, and actually talking about that as an idea at the very start, that gives you a very good foundation of being able to level up then when you start touching on subjects like pornography.
Mm.
You can actually talk about what does consent look like in your everyday. Opening a door for a person, is that consent? Is that actually undermining that person's identity or their gender,
Mm.
or is it not? So even simple things like that and discussing consent in a non-sexual manner starts to lay the basis of what is a good way to actually
Yeah.
approach the subject of sexual violence.
So when we're talking about non-sexual ways of educating kids on this sort of sensitive topic, I think that's a really important point to make, because there's a lot of educators, there's a lot of school leaders who maybe don't feel comfortable because they believe it is going to become a sexual conversation and they don't want to cross that line in an educational environment. So really making it about consent and questions and examples that are in their everyday life. That's I guess a good way of sharing that you don't need to be afraid of these conversations to make an impact, right?
Absolutely. And when I talk to people, and I've talked to the safety advisory group, and even people within the Australian education system, I say the idea of consent
Mm.
should happen at a very early age. So when we're looking at primary school or even kindy, and we're talking about playing with one another and sharing toys, um, looking at this thing of where a child goes, no, I don't want to play, understanding what that means. They've actually said
Mm.
no. They've said that this should not be, they didn't want to actually get involved. So looking at the consent, even simple things of everyday lives with parents and guardians and even family members, going over to actually greet a child within the family circle and actually giving them a hug. And if the child doesn't want to give a hug, don't force that, because what you're actually teaching the child is that saying no is okay. And actually you can actually turn around and go, okay, that's how they start to implant the idea of consent. So you're
Yeah.
not using sex as an actual way of actually approaching the topic, you're actually using everyday activity to approach the topic, which gives a little bit more stability to
Yeah.
those educators who are afraid to actually approach the subject of sex. But
Yeah.
it also gives a bit of reinforcement as the child grows up of what is appropriate behavior and what is not appropriate behavior.
That's right. I guess these attitudes, behaviors, skills, they're transferable, right? A conversation about opening a door or a hug is the same when it comes to situations where you need to advocate for yourself if something isn't okay. We've talked about what works. What are your thoughts about what doesn't work in a school environment? Are there any solutions or examples through your, your past experience that you've seen, tried, and maybe failed, something that you could share as a not to do?
I think one of the biggest things I've seen, I've actually talked to youth advisory groups about this, is having the most senior teacher come in and actually talk about sex or sex education or relationship education, especially if that person is in a leadership role within the
Mm.
education environment. That's not going to help or going to promote good communication. Um, Laying down the law is also another one that's not going to promote the open conversation. We will not accept this. This is not this is not tolerance. Or doing the scare tactics. If this keeps going on, we will ring the police and they'll do an investigation.
Mm.
So you're using the arms of the law enforcement agency to actually frighten the children or frighten the young people into submission. So
Yep.
those really hard, fast rules, which I've experienced in my education environment growing up, they just don't work, and we know they
Yeah.
don't work.
No. And certainly, again, just going back to the world of policing, what we used to find so hard is when schools or even parents would use the police as a threat, because it creates this fear of coming forward and seeking help. And we want young people to come to us, talk to us, share with us what's going on, and see us as that safe, trusted adult, don't we? And, that kind of jargon, that kind of conversation in the negative can really shoot everyone in the foot, can't it?
Absolutely. And like we're seeing a rise in sextortion, the extortion through sexual images on young people day in, day out. It's constantly rising up. And what we need to talk about is how do they actually get the intervention? They can go make an online call to not for profit organizations or talk to the e safety commissioner. But
Yeah.
sometimes they're in such a desperate state at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. Those helplines aren't available, and the only people they can actually call is seek advice from police. If you
Mm.
have vilified the law enforcement agencies, and they're the ones that are actually the worst case scenario to call, you're going to have a very isolated and
Mm.
a young person or child in a situation where they don't know who to reach out to, and then their
Yeah.
harm becomes greater and greater.
It's a really scary thing, sextortion. I mean, the rise of it is significant, especially for our teen boys.
Yeah.
I think there's a statistic of around 42, 43, where, the experience of sextortion has been attributed to them taking their own lives, which is absolutely tragic. And it's important to understand that these aren't just random people. These are criminal gangs, organized crime that are starting to target kids. So it's not a fair fight. And we really need to make sure that we create environments around young people at schools and at home where they feel they can come forward, that they're not going to be judged, because it's quite an intense experience. I watched, there's a great resource by the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, I think, called No Escape Room. And it's an interactive video where you can, I guess, experience what it's like to be sextorted, the volume of messages, the things that are said, the emotional triggers, the social engineering. And I think, tools like that, when used appropriately, are important for educators and school leaders to get a real handle on the real experiences of young people. Would you agree with that?
I think looking at the ICMEC, the National Centre, is one of our sister agencies. Looking at those resources before you actually sit down to deal with the complaint or deal with the disclosure actually
Great
allows
point.
you to have an empathetic response to that young person coming forward, because what happens is you suddenly realize what they could potentially or are going through at that point in time. So even before you sit down to engage with that conversation, have a look at those videos. Educate yourself really, really quickly, because what will happen is, while it's such an emotive subject, it will then prepare you for what the feeling that person, even though they may not have the words or the ability to express that feeling, you already have an idea of what they're actually going through.
Yeah. And I mean, in the end, we connect as human beings through hearts and minds, don't we? And
Yeah.
we need to know that someone's on our side. And that happens often before the incident. It's in the conversations that we have in the classroom. It's in the school policies that we have, where we're including student voice, for example, to try and make sure that we're addressing this in a way that they see as beneficial. How would you, I guess, describe, or how would you share with schools? How do they know if something's working or not? I guess is what I'm trying to ask. If they've put strategies in place, like we've just discussed, how are they going to know it's having the desired effect?
I think when you look at students in the education environment, they're not shy in complaining. And they're also not shy of saying, this is actually going really well.
Yeah.
Um, and what I'd say to them is, like, when you're looking at your youth advisory boards or you're looking at your student councils, don't think about just the high achievers coming onto those student councils. If you're going to set up something, don't leave it to the students to actually vote these people onto these advisory boards. Start looking at the different demographics within your schooling environment or your education environment, and bring in this group. Because what happens is, often when we look at student councils and leaderships within the school, it's popular kids, or there's a bit of balloting going on to actually get onto that student council. But if you're setting up a group, you want to have a good cross demographic of the student body. There's people that are actually quite quiet, shy, introvert. There's other people that can actually have a voice for those that are struggling with this, but they're not the popular person because they have
Yeah.
subdued themselves.
Yeah.
So I say, how they know they're working is when you have a body of students being able to say, this is working, this is not
Yeah.
working, because you've already created the open conversation environment. Um, and also, if it's not working, they'll be quick to tell you this is not working, because they're not
Subtle
shying.
as a sledgehammer, they say.
Absolutely, absolutely. Students would not be in the diplomatic corps.
No, that's right. And look, this is what we love about them, right? So we don't have to guess, they're going to tell us. But I really love that idea of having that cross section. It's something I'd advocate all the time for, because you do get those kids that are maybe naturally high achievers, naturally confident, want to be involved in everything. But actually, it's the ones that are the quiet ones that maybe don't always put their hands up. We want to hear what's really going on, not just what they think we want to hear. That's where we really get to the sort of golden nuggets of solutions. And as you say, having that cross section, whether it's different year groups, so we've got a peer-to-peer mentoring sort of scenario going on, that we've making sure that we've got, boys, girls, gender diverse young people, and making sure that we've got different cultures and races involved as well. It's very important to have that diverse point of view, because there can be key differences. I mean, even from a cultural point of view, if we're thinking
Yeah.
about something like sextortion, the shame, the embarrassment, the problems that can happen, I guess, depending on what culture that you're in, that's a whole other layer of complexity for young people to navigate. So having that cross section is really important. When a school's doing things really well, how should they measure success to show other schools that this has been a success so that they can adopt it as well? What would be the best way to measure success of a program or an initiative for schools so that they can share the love?
I think measuring success can be at times quite difficult, especially in this area. I mean, I hate to be rude about it, but you're not going to have like the anti-porn indicator within the school. But what you're going to have is you're going to have the community and the relationships that are being built within the community. So how do you actually bring that in? And the best way to measure success and help other schools is through storytelling. looking at an incident, looking at the interventions that you put into place, and actually showing that this is how the intervention took place. Bringing the students to say, we know that you have a voice, we've empowered you to have that voice. We want you now to show how we actually empowered your voice and what was successful, what actually failed as well, actually talking about failures and not being ashamed, because failures, as I say to the team in ICMEC Australia, failures are what we call the education moment. We actually address, acknowledge, and take action. And this is where you actually say, don't be afraid of your failures, because you're going to fail a number of times before you get it right. And that's what education is about, trying something different, seeing if it works, and if it fails, you pivot and you move on. So using your student body as a voice to success is the most important way you can actually measure.
I think that is amazing advice. Failure, is never fatal. It is those stepping stones to, a long-term solution. And I also really love how you, I guess, have shared that it's not always data that has to tell the success story, that sometimes the creative side, the arts, that's the way. Again, we talked about hearts and minds, but we've got to think about the sorts of learners that we have in our communities. We've got our left brain, our right brain people, and often, we're really drawn to results in different ways. So I think students would be really engaged in the creative elements of a success story like that, and really capturing, again, the emotions of people who are part of that process. I have one last question for you, Colum, just before we wrap up. And, it's really just about a key message that you have around student digital safety, even around this topic of pornography, that you'd like our listeners to take away. What would that be, that one message for them?
The one message I would say to people is open the conversation. Because when you open the conversation and actually talk to people, even about digital safety, even about devices, and you can talk about security and all these different ways, but opening the conversation allows you to learn, and then also allows you to intervene where a child is in trouble. This is the whole point that we bring in with ICMEC Australia. Is it's not just about the device, it's actually the knowledge. They're in an education environment. Have the conversation and let them share that knowledge with you, so that you can actually then get a lesson learned and then put a plan in action.
That's the thing. We can't go anywhere without that conversation happening first, and making that safe environment one that's desirable for young people. I think that's fantastic advice. Colum, at Corey, we often say that as the digital world evolves, so do we. And I can't tell you how glad I am that schools have partners like yourself and the team at ICMEC to rely on. It's absolutely crucial work. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you.
Thank you, Yaz, for the invitation and for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I should say as well, if there's anything that schools need to know about the work at ICMEC, Colum, what is the website? Throw us your contact details.
So contact us at icmec.org.au, and if you need to send an email, info@icmec.org.au. We're here to listen. If we don't know the answers, we will acknowledge the actual question and find a response for you. So like that, we will also learn with our education partners.
Oh, amazing. What a way to end the session. Thank you, Colum. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope you'll join us again soon.
Thanks, Yaz.
Thanks so much for listening in. If you enjoyed today's episode of Coria's Spotlight on Student Digital Safety, subscribe now, give us a follow, or reach out to let us know what you'd like to hear more about. Spotlight is all about providing useful information for schools by schools, and we can't wait to hear from you.